welcome to another video in the IBM Aptiva 2140 restoration. At the start, this PC was 100% junk, inside and out, with a dead motherboard, a rusty case, heavily damaged shielding, and plastic panels missing several of the guides they need to stay attached to the case. Over the course of the last two videos, all 84 broken traces on the motherboard were successfully reconstructed. We got a clear on-screen display and post again, with no board errors whatsoever. Got working peripherals, installed the OEM-specific version of Windows 95 OSR2 that came with it from retail, and maxed out the RAM to 384 megabytes. In this video, we'll restore and paint the case, clean up the motherboard, put everything back together, and celebrate with some more hardware upgrades. Removing the panels from the case was easy. Since most of them are missing guides, they just popped right off. The shielding on the inside of the door had some bad flash rust to it. Additionally, it was bent and kind of mangled in a number of unsightly ways. It appears that the case door plastic was molded directly to the shield from factory. To remove the shield from the door, I used a pair of wire cutters to cut the plastic molded tips holding it on. All the case panels have manufacturing timestamps on them. In the case of this Aptiva, all the panels were molded sometime between September and October of 1997. Removing the rust from the case was a three-step process. First, I sanded it down and removed as much rust as I could by hand. The results were okay, but there was still too much rust inside tiny crevices and seams for it to be passable. The next step was to soak the case in a 50-50 solution of water and white vinegar, where it sat for up to 2 days. While white vinegar does a great job of removing rust, its corrosive nature can also greatly accelerate oxidization and lead to flash rusting. To prevent this from happening, I used some brake fluid, Scotch-Brite pads, toothbrushes, and Q-tips. This combination did an exceptional job of cleaning up the remaining rust out of hard-to-reach seams and crevices, and it also provided a thin coat of protection to prevent sections of the case from flash rusting while it was still being worked on. Once the case, the hard drive caddy, and the optical drive bay were thoroughly rust-free, I removed the vast majority of the oil by wiping them down and using compressed air. With all the metals free of rust, they were ready for their first coats of primer. I taped the stickers and panels off as best as I could with masking tape, and began the process of priming them. It was a particularly nice day out with low humidity and lots of sun, perfect for a job like this. When they dried, I flipped everything over, primed it again, and repeated this process for upwards of 2 to 3 coats. Once everything was thoroughly primed and dry, I had two distinct choices for the finishing coat, either midnight blue to go with the IBM theme, or a chrome silver look to match the original shiny look of the shielding. I decided to use both, spray painting the case midnight blue and the shield, caddy, and optical drive bay a silver chrome. Like with priming, everything received multiple coats on both sides. It was then taken to a dry storage area and left to treat for a few days with an industrial fan. While the case was drying, I soaked all of the plastic trim in a bucket with hot water and dish soap. Since the shielding on the case door was rusty, it left a few stains on the plastic underneath. The handle on the top of the case also had a lot of rust emanating from one particular screw in its socket, and that in turn left some more rust stains that required deep cleaning. The IBM logo on the front panel was missing the blue paint it had from factory, and it had a chalk-like material caked around it. Otherwise, the case panels cleaned up easily with a soft dish sponge, a toothbrush, and some Q-tips to get deeper into the crevices. Once they looked thoroughly clean, I left them to dry outside in the sun for a few hours. With the panels and the case itself ready to be put back together, there was still some pre-assembly to do. As mentioned earlier, I had to cut the plastic tips that molded the door panel to the shielding. Additionally, the extra notches that the shielding is supposed to snap into had broken off as well. Fortunately, there were enough cues from the cut of the door panel itself to easily guide it back into alignment. Once it was properly aligned and positioned, I went over all of the missing tips and notches, about 20 spots total, with a hot glue gun, and that did a pretty good job of securing it back in place. It's a reasonably heavy shield, and if I hold the door panel upside down, it stays in place really well. All of the case panels had enough of their hooks left to go back on and stay on except for the faceplate. Every tab on it was broken. At the start of the video, it was loosely held on by bread ties. Since there's no way to properly secure it to the case otherwise, I opted to loop zip ties through some of the vents along the back of the faceplate. The last hurdle was making a new switch for the PC that mimicked the behavior of the original. The original switch is a proprietary 6-wire, 6-pin cable that powers the on and off push button and 2 green LEDs which denote power on and disk activity. Between the 6 wires, the disk activity LED uses 2, the power LED uses 2, and the on and off switch uses 3, sharing 1 wire with the power LED. On an ordinary motherboard, this would be very easy to wire up with standard cables. This motherboard, on the other hand, uses a proprietary Molex fitting that's rather uncommon. The socket is too small and the pinout is too narrowly spaced apart to work with standard PC switches and LEDs. I got fairly lucky because I found the exact same plug in the front panel of a broken car tape deck in a junk pile. The odds were pretty low, so the way it all worked out was very nice. And I just had to cut the wire from the front of the panel. It fit perfectly into the motherboard socket. The first thing I did was strip down each wire and begin mixing and matching them to see what turned the computer on and off and which wires powered which LEDs. With some trial and error, it was eventually determined that the brown and red wires turned the computer on, the brown and blue turn the computer off, red and green go to the power LED, and orange and yellow are for the hard drive activity LED. The wires were then spliced and extended out to the top of the case with part of a junk Cat5 Ethernet cable. After some more testing and troubleshooting, the splice was undone, and all the wires were soldered in place and insulated with some shrink wrap tubing. The extended wires were then cut to length, stripped, tinned, and soldered to the LEDs and a single pull double throw on-off switch recycled from another junk cable. I decided to go with blue LEDs instead of green, and after some trial and error lining up the switch and the LEDs to their proper locations under the handle cover, the switch was staying in place, it was working great, and the LEDs were lighting up in their proper spots. To fill out all the expansion bays, I'm using an IBM branded CD-ROM that shipped with this particular model, a Sony CDRW drive from 2007, a floppy disk drive emulator, and a zip drive in place of the original floppy drive bay. Both the CD-ROM and CDRW drives were completely taken apart, cleaned, and greased. The drive belt in the CDRW looked a bit inelastic, so it was soaked in hot water. Upon hooking them up, the pair were recognized in the BIOS and by Windows. Both have been tested with various disks and are confirmed working. The floppy disk drive emulator also worked flawlessly out of the box. Despite cleaning up the zip drive, I don't have anything to test it with right now, so I have yet to hook it up, but it is a good-looking placeholder, and maybe it still works. Next, it was time to test out and fill up the PCI slots. First up was a Maxtor Ultra 100 RAID card. If it works, its IDE interface would allow for much faster data transfer speeds than the IDE interface on the motherboard, and that's especially useful with, say, compact flash or SSD, SD cards, which theoretically go much faster than any kind of IDE interface, let alone this very old one that's on the motherboard. This Maxtor Ultra 100 card has its own BIOS. After the motherboard finishes its startup routine, the card jumps in and scans for drives that might be attached to it. After installing the drivers on Windows and rebooting, I hooked up a 128 gig SSD formatted to FAT32. I attempted to migrate the 4 gig SD card that I installed Windows 95 onto, and I tried it in a number of different ways, but I had no luck. I tried to boot it from the PCI card's IDE interface with different adapters and different types of 40 and 80 wire IDE cables, but no combination of things worked. It froze on the Maxtor BIOS screen every time before it even finishes seeking drives. Windows 95, at least this particular variant of it, only seems to boot when the drive is hooked up to the motherboard with a 40-wire IDE cable, but once it boots, it has no trouble talking to any of the drives hooked up to the card. Next up, we'll install a 3DFX Voodoo 2. I got this at a yard sale many years ago, and I never had an appropriate computer to use it with. Up until this point, it was completely untested. The Voodoo 2 is interesting in that it is not just a dedicated graphics card in its own right, but requires video input from some other source. In this case, it's the motherboard's integrated graphics, and in many others, some dedicated 2D graphics card. And then it augments its 3D acceleration capabilities on top of that. This is a legendary card now, and I am very lucky that I got one at a yard sale so many years ago. Okay. So we have the Voodoo 2 installed now. I'm not entirely sure if this is the original or if it's just an aftermarket cable. If it is the original, that would be pretty interesting. Okay. So there it is. Motherboard VGA output, Voodoo 2 input, Voodoo 2 output to our monitor. So let's plug all this back in and see if we have a working Voodoo 2. Okay, and we do have output. So it looks like the odds of this Voodoo 2 working are pretty high. Let's see what Windows 95 prompts us with. It should detect new hardware. And it did. So the Voodoo 2 driver is actually an EXE. So we'll update the driver. So that extracted the driver to Windows temp. Let's install DirectX. Okay, looks like we have DirectX 8 installed. It's having a bit of an identity crisis. There we go. Yeah, it's reading our Voodoo2. So I have this Trident 975 for 2D, and that is upgradable by another 2 MB with SG RAM. Let's test direct draw on the integrated Trident chip. Okay, let's do Direct 3D. Okay, now let's try it with the Voodoo. And that is a sure sign that the Voodoo is working. I think we crashed Windows. But Voodoo2 doesn't have 2D acceleration, so that's funny. Let's test Direct 3D. Okay. And it is a 12 MB Voodoo2.